Good morning. This is part 2 of Phylum Chordata. Now, we are going to get into subphylum Vertebrata. Again, we are talking about basically 5 characteristics that they all have: a dorsal hollow nerve cord, a notochord, a set of pharyngeal slits, or something that looks like gills and does not always happen to be that, a postanal tail, and thyroid-like tissues. Now, we get into the vertebrata where we have an actual vertebral column, which basically means that the notochord goes away. And it is not replaced right away, but the notochord much of the time turns into the vertebral column. It stretches and covers over the notochord as a protective barrier and a little bit of a skeletal system, depending on the type. We also have the cephalization. So we have the head with a large brain in it, or something like that, depending on who you are. And then we have this protective covering on it, usually called the skull. So when we're going into this group, we're going to talk about the jawless fish first and then go from there. So every other animal in the subphylum Vertebrata, or this entire group, has a vertebrae of some sort. So that's a shared characteristic. And then we'll talk about the jawless fish. Oddly enough, its basic characteristic that makes it special in the subphylum Vertebrata is that it does not have a jaw. Agnatha, a being without, nagtha, meaning jaw. Okay, so now that I've explained that, the class Agnathan is a very, very old group. If we look by the evolutionary charts, basically there are fossils of Agnatha very far back. And this is a different evolutionary tree that has been shown, that there are die-offs of major classes as seen by the fossil record, going all the way back to the Devonian period. But in this group, there are 2 types that we see a lot of. It's hagfish and lampreys, and around here, the lampreys are the big thing. Anyway, this is the jaw, the mouth of the fish. It does not have a jaw. It may flex a bit, but it has these teeth. These teeth are made of chitin, which vies with enamel for the tightest or the strongest organic covering in the world. So it hooks in with these teeth, it hooks in with the sucker, and then scrapes away until it can get blood happening on the animal, and it'll suck that in. That's right. These are, at least the lampreys, are blood feeding. The hagfish are more feeding on dead organic tissue at the bottom of the sea. But for the lampreys, you can see that they have these long black bodies, and they'll attach to these fish and suck their blood. And then even if they fall off, they leave these large open wounds that can cause bacterial, fungal, viral infections. When you have something this large sucking your blood, you're not going to live as long, and you're not going to have a good life. And this one even got into the gills. That's a perfect target for these, because it just hits these blood-rich areas so easily. So this is a species that we don't really want in our fisheries. So a lot of them live in the ocean, but there are a number that live in freshwater. So the lampreys can cycle between freshwater and the ocean, so saltwater. And they actually have to turn on different genes to go into each part. And that's a very controlled characteristic, as in not many animals can go back and forth between them. And understanding how they can do it will help us understand how uh, other animals survive in these environments and what we can do to not stress them out. So they have larvae that live in the freshwater streams. For the lampreys, at least, they live there for a number of years as filter feeders. Sometimes when we're shocking the river, we'll shock a whole bunch of sea lampreys, the small ones, and it looks like there's snakes in the water. Then you will hear your fearless leader scream like a girl, or somebody who is, yeah, with a much higher pitched voice. Let's put it that way. And all of a sudden, he is transported onto the bank, possibly dancing around uh, like his young children when they see an earthworm. Actually, no, they're okay with earthworms. Okay, so they then spend a number of years that way, and as they develop, they migrate out. And we even have them in the Great Lakes because of the St. Lawrence Seaway that connects all of them out to the ocean. So they'll change their genomic expression patterns in their gills and other places, and all of a sudden they can tolerate seawater and live their best life. And then they come back in to mate and lay their eggs in the streams, in the freshwater streams. So they have to change their genome again to come back in. So, class Mixnii is a major one for this, and this closer picture shows some of the really nasty wounds that fish can get from that. And here's the St. Lawrence Seaway. We can go in through the Great Lakes. I bet you guys didn't know all of the lakes, but basically we have sites along all these where we sample for the sea lampreys or the lampreys because they are an invasive species. They're not supposed to be here, and basically they've wiped out the fisheries that we used to have in the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan, but also Lake Superior. So they have a uh, a cartilage skeleton, which is interesting, and they have a pretty complete one, including supporting the dorsal hollow nerve cord, which is their equivalent of the central nervous system. Now, since this is um, a cartilaginous fish, the next class also has a cartilage-based skeleton, and both of these are not only because this is an early skeleton, but also it's a lighter skeleton to have in the water. This skeleton will help with buoyancy instead of having a mineral-heavy, uh, dense bone structure. They'll help them sink and not help them float. A cartilage-based one will not have as much density, so sinking ability, and the buoyancy will help them control their swim through the water. So, with the class chondrichthyes, ichthyes referring to fish, and you'll see this with the next group as well, or the next class. Chondra refers to cartilage, and ichthyes to fish, cartilaginous fish. So their skeleton, like the last group, is cartilage, but they also have jaws. So that's why they are separated between the agnatha and the chondrichthyes. They also have fins that help them swim through the water, actually kind of fly through the water, really. And then they have this very odd skin called denticles. And it is basically the same as their teeth, except smaller and not as jaws-y. So we have this notochord, and then it develops into this cartilage protection around uh, the dorsal hollow nerve cord into a vertebral column. You can breathe, they can breathe through gills. They force water over their gills, and in this case, it's kind of like a ramjet engine for some jet airplanes. They force air over their lungs by continuously swimming. And there are a couple exceptions to this. There are certain sharks, like nurse meg sharks, that can sit at the bottom and pulse their gills with the skin over them to move water over them. But many of the sharks animals in this group have to keep moving. Otherwise, they basically drown. If your prey blocks your mouth for very long, they don't have that water forced over the gills, and it's like they're choking or asphyxiating. So this is an interesting developmental change, but it's also an important one to understand, that they have to keep swimming to get that gas exchange. Now, it is interesting that they also have produce urea. And they also keep a lot more urea in their bloodstream and in their tissues than our bodies can tolerate. Urea usually causes our proteins to actually denature or unravel, so they don't have the same activity or any activity at all. So the sharks have, or the Chondrichthyes class has developed a way to have basically very strong bonds in between proteins so they won't be denatured by urea. And the urea is there to kind of trick the salt concentration out into the water, to make sure that it thinks, or the water thinks, that the salt is equal on either side of this tissue layer. The water otherwise would stream out and try to dilute the ocean, because there is a high concentration of salt and not as much of water as what you would find in the body. But since it has a high amount of urea, this mimics that a salt difference with its ions, or ionic charge, and therefore the water stays in the body. Now we do have the problem with purifying water, so it'll swallow a lot of the salt water, and it has a specialized organ called the salt gland that will concentrate the salt and pull out pure water, and then get rid of the very, very, very salty water as an excretion product. So it has urea. It uses urea in multiple ways, and then uh, um, also releases urea as well. Of course, this is a shark. Almost everybody can identify this as a shark. It has a very classical dorsal fin that cuts through the water, but it also has the pectoral fins. Now, this is important to realize, because basically this is the first group that can actually move through the water in kind of a flying motion, angling its pectoral fins. Also, the pectoral fins help it balance in the water, so it has less pitch and yaw. It can angle it so it will go up in the water column or down in the water column. And the dorsal fin helps stabilize it as well, top to bottom, side to side. It has a very elongated tail, which helps with angling the water and forcing the shark through the water, so it can go up or down as it pleases. And of course, the buoyancy of the lack of a skeletal system that's really heavy helps. They also help balance themselves, or make themselves buoyant, like a negative, or a neutral buoyancy, I should say. So they'll just float in the water column, and then they just push themselves through the water instead of having to worry about pushing themselves up all the time to keep from sinking. They have this very oily liver that the oil helps with the buoyancy and helps them float. It is really oily when we're dissecting sharks. I wanted to show you the skin of a shark, because they are quite interesting. This is a cross section. It's called a histological section, and this is the skin. And here's these small denticles coming out. They're like little sideways teeth that are tied into the dermis here. And here's the musculature. So this is basically millions of tiny teeth that are overlapping. And they're actually called placoid scales as well. And essentially, they direct the water flow. And if you look at electron micrographs of this, you will see each of these placoid scales will overlap each other and cause little channels to occur. And it turns out that the water is directed through these channels, and it actually speeds up their ability to swim through the water. And directionality of the water reduces the drag of the water. And so when you look at it in a large scale, no pun intended, um, the DARPA, the Defense Initiative research found that they uh, could decrease the amount of drag on large vessels and even small vessels. And not only that, reduce the amount of bacteria, algae, even the amount of clams and other things attaching. So not only do they reduce drag, this also increases the fuel efficiency. They don't use as much fuel, especially going at fast speeds, because they're micro directing the water. Here is an example of their synthetic plactoid scales, where they have this broken up pattern, but it does direct the water through these channels, and this greatly increases the efficiency of the movement through the water, because we're mimicking, understanding and mimicking this natural phenomenon. Now, there was an effort in the early 2000s to mimic this as well for uh, U.S. swimming, Olympic swimming, where they had these bodysuits, and it directed the water over it like this, and it actually turned out it worked. It was a number of I think it was 9/10 of a second or something like that it shaved off their times. So after that year, it decided the Olympic Committee decided that this was cheating and outlawed those kind of suits. It turns out it was only working in water. They tried it in speed skating for air, and it did not work. So it actually slowed them down. It is interesting that that technology was tried and successfully used. Uh, that being said, Michael Phelps still showed in multiple Olympics that he is the king. There are a number of organisms that have similarities with sharks, and most of them are skates and rays. And the difference between the skates and the what we would think of as manta rays is that the skates have this fin, a very small dorsal fin on top, even though they're flattened out. They actually will produce eggs called mermaid purses, and their offspring will develop in them, attached to seaweed and such, and look like seaweed, and then hatch. Whereas the rays will actually produce live young. Viva refers to live, ovi as an egg. So what they hatch out is different, or lay is different. The rays, live young, they don't have a dorsal fin. They do have a spine, and it flips out sideways, and they can whip it like a spike on a baseball bat, I guess, if somebody would ever do that, as a weapon. Now, other than that, they are very docile creatures unless you step on them or bother them. They feed on the bottom. Sometimes they eat clams and stuff, but then they have these slits. They'll blow the excess out the top. So those are part of their gill set. Very interesting animal. And they have radial lines of connecting cartilage going out from the center mass. It's a very interesting organism. I love having students dissect these in vertebrate biology. I'm going to go through class Osteichthyes as well, because it's a good comparison between that and Chondrichthyes. If you remember, ichthyes means fish, osteoclast, osteoblast, osteo means bone. Osteichthyes, bony fish. Now, they have this skeleton that is very similar to ours, with calcium and mineral deposition. So they tend to sink a little bit more. They don't have the buoyancy just by their skeleton that the Chondrichthyes class does. So they need a new developmental type of organ called a swim bladder. And basically, this is an interior air balloon that stretches its a good part of its body and helps them balance in the water column. So if they take out air from it, and it's usually oxygen, molecular oxygen, um, if they take oxygen out, they'll sink. And if they put in oxygen into that group, they'll rise. And it is an absolutely fascinating mechanism where they add oxygen to this bladder by making this one area of their tissues more acidic in the blood, and therefore the bloodstream in that area is more acidic. And as well, you know from your hemoglobin studies that if you make the area more acidic, hemoglobin will drop off more oxygen there. So it can drop it off directly into the swim bladder. Now, when we were looking at the body types and such, unfortunately, we weren't able to go sampling this year, but you can tell the differences in body types and really what they are feeding on. If they're feeding on the bottom, they have these kind of Hoover type suction mouths that point downward. If they're more forward, they're usually hunting things like insectivores or actually other um, fish, things like that. Now, the evolutionary link between bony fish and land is believed to be the coelacanth. And for a long time, they thought these were completely extinct, but it turns out you can catch a lot of them in deep ocean near South Africa or the Cape Town area. Now, the coelacanth have very fleshy lobes to their fins. And it is theorized that then some animal sometime then decided, hey, I could get close and kind of stump up on land. And there are a couple fish that have structurally enforced fins to get them up on land. However, the lung part is kind of important, where they need to have time in the water to survive, most of their time in the water to survive, but they can escape predators on land for a brief bit. This is not quite ready to run a marathon, however. So there is some link in where there's a logical step here from a coelacanth to land organisms. However, there is a massive amount of molecular and genetic issues here that have not been proven by evolutionary science. And to be fair, probably wouldn't be able to be proved anyway. Now, here is the overall fish structure. It has the gills. The water goes through the mouth and out the gills. So they flap the actual operculum of this. Of course, they have a fully developed digestive system and an anus, and hey, a post-anal tail. They have a very nice skeletal system, lots of tiny, tiny bones that you have to make sure to get out if you're going to eat fish. And here's that elusive swim bladder. It's inside the skeleton, supporting the middle mass. And there's a bunch of blood vessels that go into the bottom and drop off oxygen and fill up this swim bladder. And then there's also a tissue on the top that, when blood is allowed to that area, will take up the oxygen and ferry it away. So you can add in or take out oxygen from the swim bladder without actually having a hole in it. Fish who cannot control their buoyancy usually have something wrong with their swim bladder. Either they're shocked and it needs to be refilled, or they actually have a hole in it. So when you catch a fish, a large fish, and you have to turn it back into the river or sea or whatever, you hold it for a little bit underneath without really scraping it up until it's restabilized its buoyancy, and then it will swim away on its own. It does have a kidney, and it pees out basically a lot of ammonia in a very dilute form, of course, because it's constantly swallowing water. So it has to get rid of it without getting rid of its salts. We've talked about the gills already, but it helps to really emphasize that these are large surface area places where you swallow the water, the fish swallows the water, pushes the water over these gills and flaps out its opelar come here as a way to cause vacuum and draw of the direction of the water. And it'll draw it over in a very specific pattern in these little uh, lamellae, which basically refers to folds of skin, and push the water over the little lamellae in a direction that is opposite of the blood flow. So it's that counter current exchange where the water is always going to encounter less oxygen in the blood. So the oxygen is going to go from the water into the blood constantly. It is an important concept to understand, and this countercurrent exchange, as I've talked about before, is used for oxygen exchange, heat exchange, salt exchange, concentrating urine in kidneys, as you might well know. There is a wide variety of fish, to the very tasty but very dangerous lionfish. It's a beautiful fish with these bony spiked fins, and they have a painful toxin in there that'll make you feel like you're on fire. So you have to be careful to get these spines away and not touch them at all. But I will say for a fact that when we're in Grenada and you're allowed to spearfish as many as you can, because they are invasive species and they're hard to get rid of because they're very good predators and hide everywhere. When you spearfish them and clean them and fry them, you will it will ruin you for fish fries here. And I hate to say that, but a lionfish is very tasty, and we have no guilt for overfishing them. On the very far end, you wouldn't think seahorses are actually fish, but they are. They have small dorsal fins, they have gills, they have a swim bladder. It's just proportioned differently for more upright movement. They do not move fast, and the males will gestate their young and spit them out of this little slit in their stomach. They are lovely, beautiful, and delicate creatures. And they are also in this group, ray fin fish. I think I'll stop here for the second section.